You're listening to The Foundation of Wellness, a refreshing take on diet and lifestyle, with Jessica Dogert, a registered dietitian nutritionist, and Marisa Moon, a primal health coach. Hey everyone, it's me, Marisa Moon. I'm a certified primal health coach and intermittent fasting instructor, and you can always learn more about me at marisamoon.com. And I'm so happy you're here with us on the Foundation of Wellness podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Stephen Hussey, who you might be becoming familiar with thanks to us having him on here as a repeat expert. We just love having him on to help us straighten things out and always use ancestral health as our guide. He was first on our show, episode number 40, where we dove into the concepts of his profound book called The Health Evolution, Why Understanding Evolution is the Key to Our Health. And we also had Dr. Hussey on recently to talk about the controversial but life-changing diet called the carnivore diet. Take a listen, episode number 61, especially if you or anyone you love has an inflammatory condition like an autoimmune disease. Now today, we're here to get clear on what is causing heart attacks and heart disease, and what do we need to know about cholesterol in our bodies and cholesterol levels on our blood tests. There's so much confusion here, and so many people we love are affected by heart disease. Let's get clear today with the help of Dr. Hussey. He is a functional medicine practitioner and chiropractor. He attained both his Doctorate of Chiropractic and Master's in Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine from the University of Western States in Portland, Oregon. He is a health coach, a speaker, and the author of 2 books on health. The one I mentioned, The Health Evolution, and The Heart, Our Most Medically Misunderstood Organ, which you'll hear me mention in this video. It's really brief. It's an ebook, so go ahead and download that ebook called The Heart by Dr. Hussey. And you can always find everything by Dr. Hussey at resourceyourhealth.com. Please take a moment to share this podcast. If you appreciate the information that we're providing for you, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps other people to find our show, and we're trying to get the word out and grow our listenership. Thank you so much for your support. Let's get to it, right? You might want a pen and paper for this one. Let's go. Hey, Dr. Hussey, welcome to the show.
Hey, Marisa. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
Heck yeah. I'm hoping you can be like how Rhonda Patrick is to Joe Rogan to me. You're going to be like my Rhonda Patrick. I want to have you on a few times a year because
that'd be
you
awesome.
Have so much to share, and it's really in line with a lot of my own beliefs, but you're like 20 times smarter, so I really love having you here.
Awesome. Yeah. Happy to be here.
You were really well received at our summit as well. For the listeners, Dr. Hussey spoke on heart health from an evolutionary perspective, and a lot of my family members and friends were just raving about it afterwards. Like, I had no idea. And so I thought it would be great to have you back today to talk about heart health. There are a lot of misunderstandings, or should I say oversights, in the world of conventional medicine. Like the everyday cardiologist or your primary care doctor may be overlooking some of the most basic elements of heart health and heart disease. I don't know. Is that fair, the way I just described it, Dr. Hussey?
Yeah, I think so. I think that when it comes to like cardiology, in Western medicine, obviously it plays its role, but I think that it overlooks a lot of things. And I think there's a big misunderstanding about what creates heart health and what the cause of heart disease is.
Wow. I did read your ebook that's about heart health, and it's called The Heart, Our Most Medically Misunderstood Organ. And I was pretty blown away. I never learned a lot about the heart, so I don't know if I represent a lot of people in that regard, but when you started talking about all the examples of people having sudden heart attacks, and then in the autopsies, the blood clots were nowhere near the site of the heart attack, or the clots were formed afterwards, I was just like, oh my God, does everybody know this or not? So why don't you start talking a little bit about blood clots and why that happens in the heart, how the heart works. I mean, you just go for it. I'm not going to stop you.
Cool. Yeah, so what you're referring to there is the fact that there's been some research that shows And this is not just like one study. This is like the life work of a guy named Giorgio Beraldi. And it's very interesting that his work began around the same time that Ansel Keys came out with this, diet heart hypothesis, like in the 50s. And that's when Beraldi kind of came out with his first studies. And so it's interesting to see which direction the conventional wisdom became, because obviously there was all this hype around Ansel Keys and his theory. But Beraldi basically spent his life studying the heart, doing autopsies of people's hearts, whether they died of a heart attack or heart disease, whether they died of accidents or other diseases, and he just kind of looked at them. And he found very interesting things. He found that some people who died of heart attacks had no clot whatsoever anywhere. And so when I'm talking about a clot, there's two different things that could happen. One, we could get a narrowing of an artery by buildup of atherosclerosis in that artery, or we could get damage to an artery, which would cause it to rupture and a plaque form or a clot form that could flow down to a smaller artery and block that artery, reducing blood flow. That's kind of the general theory. But then Beraldi finds that, in one of his studies, he found that, less than 50% of the people who had a heart attack had a clot anywhere to be found. And then he found in a large majority of the 50% where there was a clot, that he found evidence that the clot was not did not cause the heart attack. It was a result of the heart attack. So basically he found something that suggested that the clot formed or became a problem after the heart attack already started, so it didn't induce it. So just very interesting things. And then he found that some people who died of accidents, whether it was a car accident or just some freak accident or whatever, who had never had any signs or complaints of heart disease, had severe narrowing of arteries and had clots, yet they had no heart symptoms. So it kind of throws a wrench into this, clot or plaque formation theory of what causes heart attacks. And so he also did this other study called his plastic cast study, where if people have ever been to those like Animal Inside Out or the Body World exhibits, they go around, like they can see these things, because what they'll do, like I remember distinctly in my head going to Animals Inside Out, and they filled the arteries of a fish with plastic material, and then they waited for it to harden, and then they dissolved away the fish, the rest of the tissue, and they were left with this cast of the arterial system. And that's what Beraldi did with these hearts. And so he was left with this perfect cast of the arterial system of the heart. And he found the most interesting thing that he found was that anywhere that there was a narrowing of an artery that was 70% or more narrowed, that the body had built what he called a collateral system of arteries around that blockage. So it basically bypassed it itself, which kind of explains why when they look at the research of the effectiveness of bypass surgeries, that there's many review studies where they look at 10,000 people over 10 years, and they see there's no real benefit to it. It doesn't prolong life. It doesn't prevent future heart attacks or anything like that. So just really interesting research. And so I've spoken with a few cardiologists about this, and they say, well, his research must be flawed because, interventional cardiologists will go in, and when someone's having a heart attack, they'll go in and they'll, use whatever tool they have, and they'll open up where the blockage is, and the symptoms will regress. And so they're like, so it has to be that there's a blockage. Yet, Beraldi's research doesn't say that that's what's happening in all cases. It does happen sometimes. So it's very interesting, and it made me wonder, so what is causing heart attacks? Like, what is, especially those ones where there's no clot whatsoever anywhere, why did this person have a heart attack? And so that's what I've kind of spent a lot of time looking into.
So how widely known is the Baraldi work? I mean, do cardiologists learn about this in school?
I don't know. I assume not, because every cardiologist I've spoken to isn't aware of them. But some of them are like, "Oh, that's really interesting. Let me read it," and so that's cool. But others are like, whatever.
I wonder if in Italy they because you said he was an Italian researcher. I wonder if it's known more in Europe or something, because that is just fascinating, and it makes you wonder how it's not commonly explored. But I do want you to, before you go on to more about heart disease, when you're talking about plaque and atherosclerosis, I think a lot of our listeners might be worried about their cholesterol. And I think before we determine what your perspective is on heart disease, we should probably talk about cholesterol, because why is that plaque there in the first place? Why are these clots forming in the first place? And people may not have symptoms of heart disease or know that they have this buildup. Should they be worried about cholesterol in their food? I'm always telling people not to anymore, but their doctors are telling them the opposite.
Yeah. So this is a huge topic, but cholesterol is like a miracle molecule. It does so many beneficial things in our body. And there's a lot of research out there showing that people with higher cholesterol live longer and have less disease and better quality of life. So, two specifically is the Leiden 85 plus study, where they looked at these people who were over 85, and they kind of tracked them for 10 years. And the people who had the higher levels of cholesterol had lower incidence of stroke and cardiovascular disease, and they had lower infection rates. They had better cognitive abilities, and they had just lower all-cause mortality. And then they found the same things in another study called the Lothian Birth Cohort Study, where they tracked these people that were born in 1936, and they tracked them throughout their life. And they found the same things. The people who had higher cholesterol in their blood had these better health outcomes, and they lived longer and were had better cognitive abilities and all these different things. So clearly, there's this disconnect between or I guess this demonization of cholesterol, and so that again stems from Ansel Keys's theory in the 1950s. That kind of took off, and the country was, they loved President Eisenhower and who he was, and he had a heart attack in the 1950s, and they were looking for answers as to why this beloved man had a heart attack, and Keys, I think, was just trying to provide that answer, but I think the theory got, it was bad science, and I think that it just got, people got caught up in it, and it just became the conventional wisdom before it was actually tested out. And so, but when we look at cholesterol and why it gets deposited in the arteries, it's not because cholesterol is just present. And the thing that proves that to me, aside from the research that shows that it just doesn't do that, is the fact that, cholesterol is distributed evenly throughout your blood, everywhere. But we only see atherosclerosis in some places. So if it was the cause of atherosclerosis, why would we only see it in some places? And why don't we see it in veins? Because there's cholesterol in the blood and veins too. We only see it in arteries. And so what's happening is that we get damage to the artery. And so we get damage to the artery because, we're exposed to too many toxins. We get too many free radicals, or they're like the Looney Tunes Tasmanian Devil. And they're going around and just wreaking havoc on the body. And we get too many free radicals from toxin exposure and that kind of stuff. And so those things can damage tissue in the body, and they can damage the lining of the artery. And what the body does to prevent that damage from becoming a ruptured artery is it tries to repair it. And it basically uses cholesterol and certain minerals like calcium as spackle to go in there and kind of repair it. And so it's
a scab. It's like forming a scab, right? Okay.
Yeah. And so it's in that sense, it's very important to have cholesterol around, because if we didn't have it around, then that artery could potentially rupture and we could have, bleeding, or when it ruptures, we have an actual clot form as it tries to repair that rupture. So to me, taking cholesterol away from the body, something it's trying to use to combat the inflammation that's causing damage, is dangerous. And so that's kind of how it happens. And it's not the cholesterol just being there. It's the repair mechanism. So it's kind of like the cholesterol was framed for being at the scene of the crime, and the reason that we don't see it everywhere is that we only get damage to some areas. And so when we look at places where we tend to get atherosclerosis, they're in places where there's high pressure. So like we tend to see it where an artery curves, and so the blood is kind of forced up against the back of that curve. Or we see it where the arteries, what we call bifurcate, which means they split. So they'll split into two different arteries. And so that area in the middle where it splits has pressure because there's blood always coming up against it. So there's those damaging molecules can be pushed up against it and cause more damage. Or we tend to see it very commonly in the heart arteries, the coronary arteries. And that's because they're under a lot of pressure because we have this beating, contracting heart that's under pressure. And so those are the areas where we tend to see more atherosclerosis. And we don't tend to see it in the veins where there's less pressure.
Wow. Well, everyone's doctor is going to be testing their cholesterol. Every time they go get their follow-up or they have their physical, they're going to be getting a total cholesterol number, their triglycerides, their HDL, their LDL, and their doctor is going to tell them they either need to make a change in their diet. Usually the doctor would suggest to watch their cholesterol in their diet or watch the fat in their diet, and their doctor would probably even suggest a medication. So when patients come to you after their doctor's given them that type of advice, what do you say to them?
Well, first of all, I tell them that I'm not allowed to put them on or take them off any medication, but I can provide them information to take back to the doctor and have that discussion there. And this is the information I give them. I tell them that, like we talked about, cholesterol is this wonderful molecule that does so many things and it makes people healthier. And I tell them that it's not the cause of atherosclerosis. But I also tell them that we cannot look at, like LDL cholesterol is the one that everybody looks at, and we can't look at that out of context with all your blood work and say, oh, yes, you have high LDL, you're at risk for heart disease, we need to lower that. This is going to give you heart disease, because the research does not back that up whatsoever. There's no evidence that dietary saturated fat or cholesterol results in increased blood levels of cholesterol. Okay. And we can talk about why, blood levels may go up for other reasons. But what I tell them is when we look at the blood work, when we look at like a cholesterol panel, we want to look at the triglycerides, the HDL, and the LDL. So if the LDL is high, that's okay, provided that the HDL is also high, which would be 50 or better, and then triglycerides are low, so that would be hopefully below 100. That's what I look for. That's kind of like the trifecta that I want to look for. But then we also need to look at markers of inflammation, because as we talked about, that oxidative stress and inflammation is what's going to cause the damage to the arteries, and that's going to cause the deposits of cholesterol and calcium into the artery walls. And so, you can have LDL cholesterol being high, but if you have low inflammation, so we're talking about high sensitivity C-reactive protein is one of the best markers of inflammation. You could also look at homocysteine levels, and you could also look at Lp(a), which is a variation of a cholesterol. And unfortunately, those are things that oftentimes aren't even taken among cardiologists. They just take a basic lipid panel. And there's lots of different nuances where you can get like an NMR lipid profile, which tells you more about the number of particles rather than just like the density of how many there are, which is a little bit more specific. But then if we look at that Lp(a) number, there's a lot of talk about, it's about the size of your LDL particles, and if they're small or big or fluffy or dense or whatever. And so the reason that LPA number is very important, or LP little a number is important, is because that little a is basically a protein that gets attached to a cholesterol molecule when it's damaged. Okay, so if we want to track whether you have inflammation in your body, the inflammation will damage the cholesterol, and we have a lot of these LP little a's being attached to the cholesterol molecule. So that number is an indicator of how much inflammation we have. And then the last thing is we want to look at insulin resistance. So we look at basically just taking your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose and finding out what your insulin resistance score is from those. Those are the things that really matter. So we really have to look at the whole panel of your blood work and take the right things, which lots of times aren't taken, and to really assess your risk. But even then, cholesterol is not causing atherosclerosis, it's the inflammation. And so if their high LDL was a problem because they had inflammation, my solution would not be to lower the cholesterol. It would be to fix the inflammation and lower that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the ways that I guide people to have better circulatory health and general health is, I think, applying to all adults today. And I feel comfortable giving this advice because regardless of what your status is at the doctor, we would all benefit from reducing processed oils like canola oil, soybean oil, things that oxidize easily in your body, and then lowering foods that cause an insulin response. So lowering your refined carbohydrates, flour-based foods, and sugars, and then trying to take care of some of your stress. I think that just those three things alone could help a lot of people in the long term regarding their heart disease risk. Is that right?
Yes, for sure. I mean, those are all excellent things to be doing. And that plays right into what we need to do to prevent heart attacks as well.
Okay.
Those things. And those are some of them that we should do. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. Well, I hope that everyone listening got some advice they can walk away with regarding your cholesterol, because I know that's too common to hear today from your physician. So ask your physician, can they test you for your C-reactive protein? And can they test you for your LP little a? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. And homocysteine.
And homocysteine levels, so that you can look into it further and then just try to eat less processed foods, less processed oils, more whole healthy fats that are from nature, like grass-fed butter and coconut oil, avocados, olive oil. I hope you guys listening know that I am all about that, and so is Dr. Hussey. So let's get back to the heart attack theory. In your book, I learned that even when people have bypass surgery, they might have double bypass, they might have triple bypass, they would have short relief from their symptoms, but then they might soon after have a heart attack, and it's just generally like accepted, like, oh, well, they just had bad luck, bad genes, I don't know. But can you tell us a little bit about why that might be and what we need to learn here?
Yeah. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So,
Okay.
So we have to explain why Beraldi found the things he found, why he found that there were people who died of a heart attack, literally died, and the heart attack was the first sign of heart disease for them, and why when he did an autopsy there was absolutely no clot. And so I think that it's very interesting that people say things like, just to get people thinking a little bit. Like if somebody jumps out from behind a door or something and scares you, people often say, oh my gosh, you almost gave me a heart attack.
Yeah.
Okay. Now in our heads, do we think that someone jumping out from behind the door and scaring you is going to cause a clot to form that's going to restrict blood flow to an area of the heart and cause tissue death? I don't think that's what we think. I think that subconsciously we know that being scared like that and having a stress response can cause a heart attack. Okay? And so that's kind of the premise here. That should get people thinking, like, why do we say things like that? Despite what Western medicine tells us about this clot theory of heart attacks. And so when we look at it, just to right out the gate tell you what causes these heart attacks with no clots present is it's a combination of three things. And those three things are not being well fat adapted, or your body not being able to readily burn fat and ketones for fuel. It is an increase in what we call oxidative stress, which we kind of mentioned a little bit already, which is an excess of free radicals in our body from toxin exposure, and burning predominantly carbohydrates for fuel. And it's an imbalance in what's called our autonomic nervous system, which basically is the system in our body that is interpreting our environment and telling us if we're in a safe or a threatening environment, and then having the appropriate physiological response. So those three things, they kind of combine, and they set up this, this situation that can lead to the series of events that can cause a heart attack. So those are the three things that you really need to be focusing on. You need to be focused on, making sure you can burn fat for fuel, reducing your oxidative stress by reducing toxin exposure and burning fat for fuel, and then making sure we balance our stress response. And so we'll go into this, and I'll kind of walk people through how these three things can predispose us to a heart attack, and then what happens in that heart attack. So when we look at the way of life, like of modern society today, and we look at those in the context of those three imbalances, there's a big problem. There's a big mismatch between how we're, our physiology and our way of life, and it's illustrated perfectly in these three imbalances. So, if we look at, most people are predominantly burning carbohydrates for fuel, because that's the most readily available source of food, is these processed carbohydrates. It tends to be cheaper, and it tends to be readily available. So if you look at the grocery store, most everything has some sort of carbohydrate there. Even in like our meats, we've added, like in sausage and things like that, there's sugar in it. Or these processed meats have a ton of sugar in them. So things that are supposed to be void of carbohydrates even have carbohydrates. And so what happens there is that our bodies learn to just burn glucose and sugar for fuel. And they almost forget how to burn fatty acids for fuel. And that happens because, given the choice, most of our body will burn carbohydrates for fuel, because it's quicker to do so, and it's easier to do. It's not the most efficient thing to do, and it's not the most metabolically advantageous thing to do, but it's quicker. And so, given the choice, it will do that. Now, that does not apply to the heart, which is very interesting to me. The heart seems to be metabolically special, and it burns fatty acids preferably. If there is glucose and fatty acids or ketones present, it will choose the fatty acids. And there's plenty of research that shows this. And so there was one article that showed that if you provided ketones to the heart, that glucose, burning of glucose decreased by 30 to 60%, because the heart chose to burn ketones instead. So providing the heart with ketones is very important, which is why a ketogenic diet, or at least being able to fat burn, teaching your body to fat burn and restricting carbohydrates sometimes is important. Okay, so that's the first mismatch, is that we eat too many carbohydrates. The second is the oxidative stress, which we've touched on. And so there's lots of research that shows that burning carbohydrates for fuel is it's less efficient, because we end up making more of these free radicals when we burn carbohydrates. And so a free radical it's basically like an exhaust. Anytime a car burns fuel, it has an exhaust. It has a waste product. And anytime we burn fuel, we have a waste product, or we actually have multiple waste products. One of them is carbon dioxide, which we breathe out. We get rid of that. Another one is water, which we can sweat out or use for, in our cells, or we can breathe it out. And then we also have these free radicals. So these are molecules that have unpaired electrons, and they really want to be paired. They want to be even. And so when they're not even, they will do anything in their power to become even, including damage tissue. And so when we burn carbohydrates for fuel, we make more of those free radicals. And if we do that too much, we can get into this state of oxidative stress.
And that's
so
something you can measure too, right? Or no? Can you measure your oxidative stress levels? I think I did that before, and it was like off the charts. It's when I wasn't sleeping, and we were trying to figure out what the heck was going on. That was kind of scary for me because I was like 30.
Yeah. Well, and oxidative stress can definitely be measured in various ways, but to measure it in a blood test, it's kind of not obscure, but some not very common markers are taken. You can look at specific damage to fats or damage to DNA by looking at different markers of that will indicate that you have oxidative stress that's causing this damage. So you can measure that, but again, they're not going to be the common test. The general
because how do people even know? Like, how do people even know they have oxidative stress? I mean, we could tell them because we know all the lifestyle factors, and the symptoms related to that, but maybe you should tell our listeners what are some signs of oxidative stress.
Yeah, signs of oxidative stress are going to be, just general fatigue or lack of energy, because the oxidative stress directly damages what are called our mitochondria, which are our energy-producing structures in our cells. And so when they're damaged, they can't make energy as efficiently, and so we tend to get tired. But literally, oxidative stress has been linked to almost every chronic disease. And I think it is especially relevant in things like fibromyalgia, because they actually, like one of the tests, it's not really a test because it's a very invasive test where they do like a muscle biopsy, which is not a very fun thing to have done. But when they look at that in fibromyalgia patients, they get what's called red ragged fibers, which is an indication of mitochondrial damage. And that happens from oxidative stress. Again, from one of the reasons we get oxidative stress is because we're burning carbohydrates, which result in more free radicals. But there's also things in our environment, like all the toxins we're exposed to, that act like free radicals in our body too. And so those are kind of like exogenous sources from outside the body that we get exposed to that also result in oxidative stress. So we're talking about heavy metals and plastics, and artificial fragrances, and when you char meat, that's a free radical. Those types of things we want to be careful about too. So that's the other mismatch, is that we've been exposed to many, many toxic chemicals, and we're burning the wrong fuel source that's resulting in this increase in oxidative stress. And the thing I want people to remember is that aside from damaging tissue, oxidative stress also depletes what's called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is this famous molecule that was discovered and won the Nobel Prize, and it's produced in the lining of our arteries, in the cells that line our arteries. And it's responsible for dilating the blood vessels. So if we want more blood flow somewhere, the nitric oxide will dilate the blood vessel so that more blood flow can get through. However, I think that it's overlooked that it's also plays a key role in communicating the signal of our nervous system, of our stress response in our nervous system to cells, okay, especially heart cells, okay. So that leads us right into this third imbalance we got to talk about, which is the autonomic nervous system, which again is our body's kind of ingrained system to interpret our environment and tell us whether we're in a safe or threatening environment so that we can have the appropriate physiologic response. And it's called the autonomic system because it does things automatically. So it's in control of things like breathing and heart rate, and the dilation of your arteries and things like that. So these are things that we don't consciously think about. We don't think, I have to increase my heart rate right now. It just happens, right? And so that's the autonomic nervous system acting. Now, normally, we should have this balanced state of our autonomic nervous system. So we should be, if we ever get a surge of adrenaline, which would signal our body that we're in a stress state or we're in a threatening environment, we should also have a smaller surge of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is kind of like our rest and digest state, which is mean we're relaxed, we can focus on digestion and detoxification and sleeping and things like that. They should always be in balance, and they should always the signals should always be in balance, keeping each other in check. And we're going to see if that doesn't happen in the heart, it can lead to a dangerous situation. Okay. And so we're going to piece all these things together. So, but before we do that, I want to illustrate that in today's society, we tend to have an imbalanced stress response because humans have this very high level thinking brain, and it's not necessarily designed for the environment that we're in. So we can literally think our way into a stress response, just thinking that something stressful could happen to us, or we see something stressful happen to somebody else, and then we fear that it's going to happen to us.
Oh yeah.
And so we can think that
Watching
that's going to happen, or we
news.
see, the news. I mean, there's something that happens, across the world that doesn't necessarily concern me or put my life in danger. I can still be concerned about it, but I have a physiologically life-threatening response to it.
Well,
my body perceives it as
all
stressful.
the anxiety, like so many people. I don't know about you, Dr. Hussey. I'm very grateful I don't have anxiety, but pretty much 75% of the people I love do every single day of their life.
Yeah,
and that's a form
anxiety
of imbalance, right?
It's a direct, symptom of an autonomic nervous system imbalance. And so the best way to track this is something called heart rate variability, which people can use different. Like I have heart rate variability, like an Oura ring, so that's tracking that as well as other things. But this mismatch between our current environment and our evolved stress response is leading to this dominance of our sympathetic nervous system. So we're kind of in this low grade stress response all the time, and that's a big problem because that's not the way our stress response is supposed to be. And so if you think about it, if I am constantly but incorrectly think that I am in a threatening situation, my body is never going to focus on detoxification or sleeping, or digesting, or reproducing, or any of those things that are very parasympathetic dominant. And so people who have autonomic nervous system imbalance tend to have things like insomnia, or digestive issues, or reproductive issues, sexual dysfunction, or detoxification issues. And so those are just some of the things that are associated with this. And so it can create a lot of problems. And I would argue that it is there's some things that we just talked about that kind of set the stage, but a sudden stress response in someone with an unbalanced autonomic nervous system is the driver of heart attacks. It's kind of the signaling event that starts the cascade of events that causes a heart attack. So I'm going to walk people through this as best I can.
Thank you.
So you've got this person who's relying on carbohydrates for fuel, and so the ketones are just not there, okay? And the heart's doing the best it can to predominantly burn fat and ketones, but they're just not there. You have this oxidative stress that's potentially depleting nitric oxide, and then we have this imbalanced autonomic nervous system. And so it's really interesting that when we look at prevalence of heart attacks, they're more common on stressful days of the year. They're more common on Mondays. They're more common on major holidays. They're more common on days of major sporting events. And I think that the association between stress and heart attacks is not a coincidence. And so if we have these three things, and then all of a sudden we get this sudden stressful event, it could be any of those things I just talked about. It could be death of a loved one. It could be all kinds of things. We get this sudden surge of adrenaline or sympathetic activity to the heart cells. And if we have that oxidative stress and that nitric oxide is not present because it's been depleted, then the parasympathetic can't reach the heart cells to balance it out. And so we get this surge of adrenaline to the heart cells, and that forces the heart cells to start burning predominantly glucose, so that happens when we have a stress response. But we have this nervous system in place to prevent that from happening in the heart. But so if you were to go for a run, that's a stressful response, and it's an okay one. We're designed to have them occasionally. And so what happens in your muscle is that your muscle starts to burn glucose for fuel. And when that happens, we get a buildup of lactic acid, and that causes muscle burn. We're all familiar with the muscle burn that happens with exercise. That lactic acid and hydrogen ions cause the muscle burn. And so if it gets bad enough, we can just stop exercising, and that lactic acid gets pumped out within about an hour. However, if the heart is forced to burn glucose, and I think the fact that it chooses to burn fatty acids when it can is kind of its protective mechanism. But if we get these imbalances, it's forced to burn more glucose, and we get this buildup of lactic acid in the heart instead. And that would cause this muscle burn, which in the heart we call angina, because the heart is burning predominantly glucose for fuel. And the heart just can't stop beating. When it happens in our muscle, we can just stop. But when it happens in our heart, we can't. And so the heart is now battling to burn fats, but it's being forced to burn glucose, especially when we get this sudden surge of adrenaline from this stressful event that happened. And so when that happens, we get this buildup of lactic acid, and we get that burn. And when it happens bad enough, that burn can refer pain down your arm or various other places, which is what the characteristic we see in heart attacks. And what happens is that buildup of acid, the cells become acidic in nature, and that interferes with. Studies have shown that an acidic environment interferes with the ability of the cells to use calcium, and calcium is what muscles use to contract. It's necessary for the contraction of muscles, and so if they can't use that calcium, then they can't contract. And then we get kind of a dysfunctional cell, and we can get death of that cell. And the other thing that happens is this lactic acid builds up and it causes swelling. And so that's another thing we see in heart attacks is we see edema or swelling, and that what that does is it changes the pressure gradient. So usually the pressure is greater coming from the arteries into the tissue. That's how it forces its way into the tissues. But if we get swelling in the tissue and the pressure becomes more there, now the blood can't get in, and so that would reduce blood flow and create tissue death or necrosis. And so that's what we would call a heart attack. That's the area of tissue death that happens. So it all happens because of the kind of predisposed imbalances that we have. Those three, where we're not, ketones aren't present. We have this high oxidative stress, and then we have this surge of adrenaline from an imbalanced stress response. And it kind of leads to this unfortunate cascade of events that results in tissue death of an area of the heart. Wow. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And it gets me thinking about, I know 3 people, well, not personally, but close friends of my friends, who died of a heart attack suddenly and had no heart disease record or symptoms. And 2 of them were while they were running, and everyone was saying how healthy they were. And it just shocked everyone. It was like a total shock, And that's really confusing to me, to everyone. And I know that you have a lot to say about that, but just before you go ahead and get started, in some of my training as becoming a health coach, it's just been about chronic endurance training, how that really induces chronic stress and inflammation and oxidative stress in the body. And just long term, it takes a toll on the heart. And runners are very passionate about what they do. It's like no other exercise can fulfill them in that way. And I have a friend who did 4 marathons in 1 month or 3 months. He's been on every single continent doing marathons. And he looks like He-Man. I mean, he looks incredibly healthy. But it scares me. There's people in my life who I really care for who endurance running is their favorite thing to do. And so when I think about the people who died suddenly of a heart attack, and then all that I know about, cardio, long distance running, inducing some of the symptoms that you're talking about, I really would like to know if you have any advice to give or some sense for us to make of these situations.
Yeah, I've posted a lot about this on social media and written some about blogs and stuff too. And there's 2 examples. One is, marathon is named after a guy, I forget his name. It's some Greek name because he ran from a battle. I forget if the battle was in Marathon or if he was running to a town called Marathon, but he ran 26 miles to deliver the message that they won the battle. And he died on the spot when he got there.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah, nobody knows what he died of, but it's just interesting that the word marathon is named after this guy, and he died delivering the message.
Oh my God.
And then the other one is that people may be familiar with that book, Born to Run, where Chris McDougall talks about the Tarahumara tribe in Mexico and how they run all over the canyons and they just run everywhere. And there was this guy in the book they talked about, and they called the people in Mexico called him Cabello Blanco, I think is what they called him. And his name was Micah True. And he was kind of the antagonist of this book and telling the story. And it's a real guy. And he had kind of lived in Mexico running through the canyons. And that's what he did. He just ran everywhere. But in the book, he talked about what he was eating and what he would take with him in the canyons. And it was like this, I think he called it pinole, which was like this form of corn. And he used to cook it in the mornings with honey. And then he would take it with him dry in a pouch, on when he would run through the canyons. That's what he described in the book. And so that's straight carbohydrates right there. And lots of runners do, they carb load because it's a quick form of fuel. And I think that I would argue that can be dangerous if these runners are not fat adapted. So I think that, on days when they have a race, yes, have carbohydrates. You need that quick fuel source. But if you're not fat adapted, if you can't run on fat for the first part of your race or the first part of your run, and you only use the glucose when you need it, like you ingest it when you need it, like midway through the race or something, that not being fat adapted is setting you up for these types of things. And I people may know who Zach Bitter is, and he just broke the record for the 100-mile race or whatever, doing the 100 miles, running 100 miles, and he is a very fat adapted guy, but he uses carbohydrates when he does these races. But otherwise, he's completely restricting carbohydrates and staying in ketosis. So his heart can burn ketones. It's very good at doing that. And so that's the first mistake I think that these runners make. And I think that that's the only one that they really have the power to change if they want to do these runs. Because, exercise in general has been shown to increase oxidative stress, which is just the nature of exercise. And there's benefits of exercise. And as long as we have, proper systems in place that we get rid of that oxidative stress, it's no problem. But I think that exercise is supposed to be, or it's most beneficial when it's short term, resistance training and then like high intensity interval training, but it's short term. And when we do it on through a prolonged period, we're making lots of oxidative stress.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's also, exercise is something that stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Again, rightfully so, and there's benefits to doing that short term. But when we do that long term, especially when we completely deplete our bodies and really put us through the grueling experience of, say, a marathon or something longer than a marathon, then we get this sustained stress response. So if we have these three imbalances, and then we go and do something that induces those imbalances even more, like a very long race, then we are potentially predisposing ourselves to this cascade of events that causes a heart attack. Now, it's not to say that everybody that runs a marathon is going to have a heart attack, because clearly that doesn't happen. But there are lots of examples of people who try and run these things, and they do drop dead of cardiac arrest during the race or soon after the race. And it's I think the best thing that people can do is be a fat adapted athlete.
You can learn about that, by the way, to our listeners. Maybe, Dr. Hussey, you can send them to some of your blog posts, too, but I wanted to let them know about Primal Endurance. It's a book by Mark Sisson, and as an ex-endurance athlete himself and a fat-adapted expert, he teaches you about metabolic flexibility, and that's what Dr. Hussey is describing. It's not that you can't have carbs. It's not that you need to live your entire life in ketosis. It's just that you train your metabolism to be able to use both types of fuel. And that is just, I don't know, that's the grand prize of life. If you can get your metabolism to be that flexible, it's pretty amazing. And then you said you have some blog posts too, and they can find those, I would assume, at resourceyourhealth.com.
Yep. That's where I post everything.
Awesome. Well, before we wrap up, I just want to make sure that we covered everything that you feel is really important to leave the listeners with today. How do you feel?
Good. One other thing.
Yes, please.
So sometimes people who go on a ketogenic diet or they start eating more fats, their LDL cholesterol will shoot up. And that can happen. And again, we talked about why that may not be an issue, but I want to tell people why that happens. And it's not because you're eating more of these fats, it's because you're switching your metabolism. Okay, so when you start to burn fatty acids for fuel, you're also going to make ketones. Your liver is going to start making ketones. And the very process of making ketones is very similar to the process that makes cholesterol. And I think it's designed that way for a reason. So by default, when we're forcing our body to burn fats and make ketones, we're making more cholesterol. So our cholesterol can go up in some people. The other reason is that whenever your liver is making all this cholesterol now, it doesn't need to take in cholesterol from the blood. So it turns off its cholesterol receptors and leaves more in the blood. So we end up seeing more in the blood. And the third thing is, this is something I think you'll like, there's studies that show that people who fast, just the act of fasting can increase cholesterol by 69%. And that is because when we're fasting, we're encouraging our bodies to burn ketones and make ketones. And again, the very process of making ketones is also similar to the one that makes cholesterol. And by default, we make more cholesterol. So some people have called them like lean mass hyperresponders, where they're fit and they're leaner and they're very efficient at making ketones, and so we get this high amount of cholesterol as well. But it's not necessarily because the cholesterol is deposited directly into your blood that you're eating. It's because you're training your body to burn fat, and the process of doing that increases cholesterol in your blood. Okay, and you're saying it's usually not anything to worry about. It's definitely not anything to worry about. It's short term. What are you leaving us with there? I would say that it's I would almost say that it's definitely not something to worry about. But again, we have to look at it in the context of the rest of your blood work. And even if the rest of your blood work is completely messed up, the cholesterol is not the problem. The insulin resistance and the inflammation is the problem. Those are the things you need to fix, regardless of where your cholesterol is. And I would suggest also they look at that HDL to triglyceride ratio, like the example that you gave. You said it would be more ideally like 1 to 2 HDL to triglycerides. Is that correct? Well, we just want the triglycerides to be low, so less than 100, and we want HDL to be within the optimal or higher range. So generally that's above 50. Okay. That's what we want. We want to see the inverse relationship there. And then once that's where it is, then LDL is just not as concerning. And I could argue that it's not concerning in general at all. Awesome. So, you made me feel better, and I'm sure you're making a lot of people feel better. I know you work with patients all over, so you take patients online as well, out of state? Yeah. Okay, great. So if anyone's interested in working with Dr. Hussey, he is a heart health expert, and he also has reversed his symptoms of type 1 diabetes. I don't know if I said that properly, but the ketogenic lifestyle has given him an incredible freedom that he talked about on episode number 40 with us, where we discussed his concepts of the book, The Health Evolution. So go ahead and check out that episode and contact Dr. Hussey at resourceyourhealth.com. And you're also on social media at Dr. Stephen Hussey, correct? Yep, Dr. Stephen Hussey. Dr. Stephen Hussey. Thanks for being here, Dr. Hussey. Thanks for having me. Wine drinkers, I want you to listen up. Even though I've cleaned up my diet quite a bit over the last few years, I still like drinking wine. I mean, I still like having fun and relaxing and all of the cultural things that come with having a nice glass of wine with company or in the evening to help wind down. But I was getting headaches while I was drinking wine. It became more and more of a problem where I just stopped drinking it altogether until I found Dry Farm Wines. Dry Farm Wines curates all of these natural wines that use old world farming methods
dry farming, organic, biodynamic practices, and they don't add any stuff to the wine either. Did you know that the FDA allows more than 70 different additives for wine treatment and processing in the United States? It's like no one's looking out for us except for Dry Farm Wines. Dry Farm Wines is a wine club that you can use and sign up for. I did it myself because it's incredible how different I feel when I drink their wine. Their wines are tested to be sugar-free and farmed organically, and to be lower in sulfites, like no sulfites actually added during the production or bottling. And they only use wild yeasts, and they're additive free, and they're really just how winemaking is supposed to be, and I love them. And I wanted to offer you a bottle for just a penny when you sign up for your first case of Dry Farm Wines. They'll deliver them to your door, and you can stop, cancel at any time with just the click of a button. It's so cool. You can choose a red box or a white box or a mixed box. They have rosés, they have sparkling. I am so in love with Dry Farm Wines. They're real, they're alive, and I don't get any headaches or hangovers when I drink them. They're amazing. So go ahead and head over to dryfarmwines.com/FOW podcast to claim your penny bottle. Again, that's dryfarmwines.com/FOW podcast. The FOW stands for Foundation of Wellness. And if you want to learn even more about Dry Farm Wines, besides on their awesome website, you can listen to our podcast interview with their founder. It's episode number 60 with Todd White. He goes through all sorts of wine industry lies and tells us about this whole field of winemaking called natural wines. You can learn about it there, and I'll see you on the next show. Bye.